Welcome, viewers, to a very, very special edition of It Depends podcast. The reason it's special is because my close friends, Doug Henschen of Constellation Research, Tony Baer of dbinsight, are with me on the floor at AWS reInvent 2022 in Las Vegas. This is the biggest AWS reInvent. It has even broken pre-pandemic records. We're over 50,000 people. No mask. Everybody is excited to be back. You can feel this excitement pulsating. But instead of me talking about the event, I would like to hand over to, let's start with you, Tony. What do you think? By the way, let's start with a question. What is this reInvent number for you? How many have you attended?
7.
7.
2016 was the first one.
Oh,
And so basically assuming that we don't count 2020, 2020, it's 7.
right. 7. Wow. And Doug?
Well, I guess I started in 2017 attending. I've covered them for longer back when I was a journalist, but attending since 2017. So we had a few misses there for the pandemic period. But yeah, so I guess that's at least 5 or 6.
Yeah. So same for me. I started in 2017. That was the first one. And by the way, the three of us are analysts. Here is my badge. And
I've got my red lanyard.
Yes. So by the way, we have the red lanyard. For those, a lot of people will stop me and say, why is your lanyard red? And red, in my opinion, but correct me, you guys have been analysts longer than me, is like, don't talk to these guys. They're media, press, analyst, and you may get...
Yeah, watch what you say in front of these guys.
Yes.
I think there are other reasons why people might not want to talk to me, but that's essentially another.
Let's keep it out. Yes, yeah. So what do you think, Doug? What has been the tempo of the 22 event? And by the way, viewers, what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to talk about the overall, like the general feel of the event. And then in the second half, we'll go into point offerings and announcements. So, Doug.
Well, yeah, I think definitely there's a good amount of buzz, high traffic, kind of back to pre-pandemic levels. Definitely the biggest event of the year, hands down. And, there are some masks, but mostly not. It's Vegas after all. So a lot of good energy. But I think as far as the presentations we're seeing a maturing AWS. And we're seeing a maturing cloud. So there's fewer opportunities for, whole new greenfield services categories. So I would say fewer announcements overall, more storytelling, and more emphasis on polishing and filling out the existing portfolios of services. You might say that that's incremental, but I like it. I like that there's less, carpet bombing of announcements, dozens at a time there's a little bit more context. I'd like to see a little bit more solutions context. And then lastly, I think there's a little bit of moving up the stack a bit to applications. You saw that with some announcements around a supply chain application and more on their contact center application. And Adam Slipsky in a session with analysts talked about taking more of an application, moving a little bit more towards applications.
Right, very nice. Tony?
Yeah, and I'll continue that thread a little bit because Adam basically hinted at that last year. And last year was actually, the first post-pandemic reInvent, but it was held at a much more reduced scale. But it was also the beginning of Adam's reign. So it was more of a vision, and we were also I think the expectation was that when Adam Slipsky took over, and it's not that necessarily it was going to be a dramatic change from Andy Jassy, but that this was going to be kind of a next stage, for AWS. That AWS for basically its origins were really essentially with techies. It was, originally, Amazon saw, looks like we can monetize our data centers. And so let's throw out a few trial balloons, and the initial takers were basically, app dev teams that, hey, let's just rent some clusters here and do some dev test. And since then, of course, it's been a certain definitely a kind of an upward sort of kind of a trend of progress. Let's put it that way. Going gradually higher and higher up the stack. Not so much for AWS, but more in terms of how enterprises were using the cloud. And that whole history session Lissy lesson would probably belong best on another podcast. But suffice it to say that at this point, I mean, Amazon has got, and it's almost kind of like a victim of its own success. It has such a proliferation of services. And the thing is, customers really need to put those together. And the other thing, it also is coinciding with the fact that customers are now starting to look at putting the mission critical processes up on the cloud. Some fashion, others obviously, those that are basically that were born in the digital world, were doing that from the get-go. But now this is really starting to get towards the mainstream. And so, and at that point, basically, large organizations need to look at technology providers like AWS as a partner. At that point, if it's just selling compute cycles and compute instances, that's not exactly the same type of thing. And so there has been an expectation that AWS would go further up that stack. Now, keep in mind, there's against the broader context of like, look how they basically compare, let's say, with Azure and Google. And Azure basically started off as being more in the application space, as it was really it was an extension of Office 365, basically, in SharePoint. So Microsoft started off with a solution, from the solution standpoint, from that point. And also Microsoft was more accustomed to the enterprise, the enterprise license than Amazon was. Google, of course, from its end, starting more from that run your organization, like Google, and now under Tom Curran has been taking more of basically I will say a solutions approach, but solutions that's very heavily focused on partners. In terms of Amazon, we've been wondering when they would step up to the plate, and we're starting to hear, as Doug pointed out, we're starting to hear some stirrings of that. I have actually some and these are just a few natural sort of I guess sort of like checks or concerns or whatever. One, they talk about retail. Well, who other than, let's say, an Amazon business partner is going to want to depend on Amazon for a retail solution and for supply chain management? In terms of that, I think there's going to be a justified concern or paranoia at the other extreme, in terms of if we work on this, if we take Amazon's retail solution, supply chain solution, will Amazon then start to basically productize that stuff for its for its own use? The reality is that at this point, Amazon probably has such a well-developed supply chain. We see Amazon Prime trucks all over the hub. That it's probably more Amazon, providing its expertise. But either way, I think there's going to be a natural hesitation. But I think the other thing also is that they are starting to go in different vertical sectors. But I think that really, outside of their core domain, their core expertise, which is basically supply chain, retail and technology infrastructure, the other domains are not, basically are not core to them, or I shouldn't say core. It's not part of what their what their core competency is. That's not what the part of their knowledge base. And so I think that ultimately, in the solution space, the vertical solution space, which so far is being presented as basically as vertically focused data lakes with some data templates and a few things added on there, connectors, I think Amazon is going to really have to leverage basically domain leaders from those spaces. And an example I would give, and I'm not saying they should literally partner with this company, but this would be kind of the type of example, is that right now Amazon is going more is a healthcare solution that's really aimed more at the clinical end, clinical research, in oncology. But let's say if they decide to go into attack also look at, let's say, personal healthcare. And that involves, electronic health records. Well, it would not make sense for Amazon to reinvent the wheel here, but instead to partner with, let's say, a leader such as Epic. Now, I'm not saying they should be doing that solution, but I'm saying that if they want to get serious in the solution space, that's the type of strategy.
Oracle bought Cerner, and you're saying that Amazon should buy Epic.
And then let's say buy. I think because ultimately they're not going to be able to buy their way into every single vertical.
Yeah.
But they could, but I think there'd be strong motivation for, say, like an Epic, for instance, where basically Oracle just bought their partner to look for, look for a hyperscaler, as a natural partner.
Right. So let's go into some like sensitive, thorny issues. So Doug, I want to ask you this. It seems like there are two camps. One camp is saying that reducing the database sprawl, fewer consolidated, unified, converged databases. There's no reason why a relation database cannot have native JSON document capabilities. But then we've got AWS saying that no, every database needs to stick to its model, purpose-built databases. So I want to ask both of you, what do you think? So Doug, let's start with you.
Well, I had a lot of questions to AWS executives about this, because I really think they went down the, purpose-built database engine path when they started as a cloud company. They created cloud-based AWS branded versions of a lot of the popular on-premises data platforms. Aurora is an alternative to MySQL and later Postgres. Kinesis, so on and so on. Elasticache. I mean, one of every version, so they could make it easy for folks with on-premises workloads to move them into the cloud. Well, it's a very different day today. We have many cloud native companies that are building applications first and only in the cloud. So I would think there would be an opportunity for them, not to necessarily get rid of the purpose-built products, but also to have more of a general purpose, something more in the vein of like an Oracle database, where to have also that option. So if they have a group of developers that could meet the majority of needs, say have time series, JSON support, I would think there would be an opportunity. So good enough to handle the majority of use cases, give us one a database to handle those needs, and we don't have to introduce the complexity of access control questions, storage questions, data movement questions, privacy questions, state, all these things that you have to answer over and over again. I think they are making efforts with some of the announcements here to have integrations. One example being Aurora to Redshift. There are other examples where they're trying to bring together some of the back end, but they did face a lot of questions during some of our analyst sessions on, trying to simplify and ease things for cloud developers to bring together a lot of the back ends of these different database engines that they have.
And Tony, why do you think there are so many purpose-built databases? What's your take on it? It's three or four words. 3 words, I think, is two pizza. 4 words. Two pizza box rule. I say that a little bit, tongue in cheek, but actually, I think there was definitely a grain of truth to that, because it comes from the startup mentality that Amazon, the day one mentality that the day one ethos that Jeff Bezos basically ingrained into the company, which is every day we still need to act like a startup. So every day is day one. And the most direct path when you're trying to be fast and innovative is not huge top-down teams, but to have lots of basically sort of interdependent, autonomous, independent teams, and keep them relatively small and keep them relatively agile. In other words, no team should be larger than, if they're staying, staying after work for dinner, working overtime, that shouldn't require more than 2 pizzas to basically feed the whole team. And so I think it's partially an outgrowth of that culture. It's an outgrowth of, we need to innovate as fast as possible, and basically it's playing more straightforward to basically go single purpose. And I think if they learned that lesson the hard way, with on the retail side, I think that's and there was a good reason for that, which is that they found that Oracle was, basically was overkill for a lot of the types of things they were trying to do with their shopping carts, for instance. Yeah. And so that's where they developed their first purpose-built database, which was Dynamo, and then a simplified version of it, which was Simple DB, and then eventually, about 5 or 6 years later, got converged and productized as DynamoDB. That has been very successful for them and continues to be very successful. It's defined a whole database product category to this day. And so,
I find the story fascinating. How
yes, it is.
I think in 2004 is when Amazon.com kept crashing and was down for long periods of time. And so Amazon engineers went to the drawing board. Swami was one of the guys who now heads all of data and analytics product. And then in 2007, they came out with a Dynamo paper. And what I find so interesting is that Dynamo paper actually led to a schism where a set of engineers went to Facebook and they created Cassandra. And then but it took 5 years until 2012 before DynamoDB was created. And I think it's been a phenomenal key value data store. So that takes care of the operational side. Now let's talk about the analytical side, because now you got Redshift, which had a very, very different origins, as we all know.
It's very different. It's very different from what it's, I think we have to emphasize very heavily. This is not par excel. Today's Redshift, and I asked that question actually, in the room at the analyst session before, to Rahul, is because he was talking about the RA3 instances, which really revolutionized. It took RA3, which was many years after Redshift was introduced, finally took Redshift really into the cloud native world. It was finally their answer to Snowflake. And the interesting and what was interesting about it was he's saying all the new features are coming out on RA3 or later. In other words, it's coming out on the cloud native architecture. So today's Redshift, even though you still have some holdovers, who basically have old versions of it that are still working on it, basically the new features are on the cloud native version of Redshift, which resembles absolutely nothing like the original.
So for those who may not be aware of this, what Tony's talking about is RA3, which is an instance type that decouples storage and compute and brings Redshift into more modern world. So Doug, I want to ask you this question. This year's been a slew of conferences, and three of us have been to so many of them, from Snowflake, from Databricks, even MongoDB, Google Cloud Next. And what do you think is the role or the uniqueness of Redshift when you have these more cloud, born in the cloud databases like Snowflake and BigQuery?
Redshift predated a lot of them, but then I think they got complacent. And Snowflake in particular has put them on the defensive. So they've been reacting. I mean, RA3 nodes were a reaction to separation of storage and compute. Last year, we saw Redshift add serverless. That was something that others had already offered. This year, we saw multiple availability zones introduced. We saw some of the data sharing and clean room stuff come about. So they keep evolving it. Amazon is the biggest, AWS is the biggest cloud. So they've got a big client base that they can keep evolving the product and keep them happy. But they certainly gave up a lot of market share, and certainly they haven't really addressed multi-cloud to most people's satisfactions. We'll probably talk about that more. So they've given up with Redshift. It's the AWS loyalists who are going to stick with that product. They've bled off a lot of potential market share to the likes of Snowflake.
Right, but can I want to speak to this a little more in terms of just where AWS is in its I guess sort of in its adolescence, or entering adulthood. So at this point, AWS was first mover into the cloud, and a lot of these purpose-built databases were like first mover. At this point, though, it's not first mover because it now has this huge portfolio that it has to maintain and modernize. And so to me, it's not surprising that things like serverless and broader Spark support are coming later. Or in fact, basically, Amazon at this point, AWS at this point, in many cases, is a follower. Now, that's not necessarily an indictment of Amazon, because in most of these, the way we move at cloud speed, is that, if you're a follower, you might be like a year behind the other hyperscaler. Is, for most customers, is that going to spell the difference between whether they choose one hyperscaler or another? Go ahead, Doug.
They haven't been necessarily behind the other hyperscalers. They've been behind some of the independents.
I think they've been behind. I mean, I think lately in database innovation, I think they've been behind Google. Frankly, and I think Oracle's has done OCI has pulled a few tricks up, has a few tricks up its sleeve. And I think it's exactly when I look at, for instance, the zero-ETL from Aurora to Redshift. That to me is classic reactive move. And it's classic reactive in terms of that it actually is following up on basically technology that's really about 10 years old. I mean, like, you can trace this back in various iterations to the household names, like even IBM, started with Blue back in I think 2013. And at that point and Blue had a number of different things. But the one that's salient here was basically a column store that sat alongside the row store, where you would then selectively replicate from certain rows of certain tables into these columns. Oracle later basically adopted that with Oracle database in memory, and we've seen other versions of it with other cloud services. I mean, MariaDB SkySQL operates on a very similar principle. So what Redshift, what Amazon was doing with Aurora to finally to basically clear a change data capture replication path to Redshift was not innovative. It was follower, and it was addressing a customer point of pain. I was interviewing basically, I was interviewing an Oracle customer that had been, well, now it's an Oracle MySQL HeatWave customer that dropped, that actually was an Aurora and Redshift customer, and dropped it for that very reason, because basically ETL was, well, one, they were paying for two databases, so that was cost center. Plus the ETL was basically the fact was that on the analytics side on Redshift, they could not be assured that they were getting analyzing current data. So this was addressing a point of pain. This was highly reactive. I'm actually surprised it took AWS this long to address it.
Yeah, but your point is that even though they've addressed it, there's still two different databases. You've got
it
Aurora,
still is. It still is.
I actually had two problems with this. My first problem was it's called zero-ETL, but there is no T in it. It's literally, you're taking the transactional data and replicating it into Redshift. So it's actually extract and load. So to me I think that name is an issue.
And they acknowledge that you likely going to need to do the transformation work in Redshift.
Actually, let me correct you, Sanjeev. Actually, their name is correct. There is zero-ETL.
Actually, there you go. It reminds me, of a joke. If you see a UFO, it's no longer a UFO because you have identified it as an unidentified flying object. So anyway, we digress.
Unidentified database.
Yeah. So we've jumped into the announcements. Zero-ETL was one of them. But I want to take a step back before we go into announcements, because Doug, you mentioned serverless a few times. So I want to take your view on serverless. It's interesting to see how there are about over a dozen analytics offerings from AWS services. The very last one went serverless this week, which is OpenSearch. But Doug, what do you think of the serverless approach?
Well, it's great, assuming if in the context of Redshift, that you do have down periods, that you do have spiky workloads.
Does it really go down to zero? Is it really all the way down? I know storage cannot be zero because it's your data warehouse, but
right. I think it varies by. I'd have to check the label on Redshift specifically,
sometimes
how far you can shut it down, how quickly you can rehydrate data into into
You
nodes.
have the data and cache. So if you elastically scale up, but there's no data not cached, then your performance sucks. And then what's the point? Then you pay that price. So Tony, serverless?
I mean, look, I mean, this is true with it's kind of like EPA gas mileage ratings, which is like your consumption.
Your mileage may vary.
Actually, that's the whole idea of serverless. But the fact is that serverless is, as Doug said, it's great if you do have variation. If you have a constant workload, you're going to get a better deal, basically, with a reserved instance. The thing is that that's more likely to happen in transaction processing than it is with analytics. Now, on the other hand, an argument can be made that when we start getting operational analytics and the workload starts to get more even, then a debate could be made. But the thing is, the nature of analytics is that usually demand varies, and so and the bonus of serverless is that it's a form of simplification. I mean, it's actually, the name is actually a little deceptive. You still have servers. You just and it's not that you have less servers unless you're not using anything, but it's really that you're not having to worry to provision servers, and so that's definitely simplification. And it can't, from one perspective, it means basically a faster on ramp. If you want to engage whatever service you're talking about. I mean, this applies to any serverless service. So
the way I define, like when people get confused with what does serverless mean, I tell them, think of it as you think of servers less. Not that they're not there.
Whoa, Sanjeev, I think you've chosen
nice
the
turn
wrong
of phrase.
field.
This is what I do.
I think we've got a better job out there for you.
Yeah, a poet. So, by the way, this year we heard a lot about new instance types. Graviton 3 is a very big deal. Although we're sticking to data and analytics, and people were asking me the HPC instances, what do you think of it? I'm like, well, if you're moving to serverless, then I don't want to think about these things. I'm as an end user, these things should not be. I should let AWS give me the best compute price performance compute instance. So.
Well, one of the AWS executives arguing again for purpose-built database engines said, well, in a serverless world, we're going to think less about, we'll just be calling a particular engine to do a particular task. But I still think it's not just that simple of like calling a database service as an API, because you still have that issue of where is the data stored? Do you need to move it? Right. Do you have access and security and privacy control over that? Is there state tied to this? Yeah. There's a lot of complex issues on the back end. That gets back to the idea of like, look, if you're going to continue to have these purpose-built products, there's going to be a need for more back-end integration of the kind, like the integration between Aurora and Redshift. Even though that's been done, there's other things that aren't terribly new, but for the AWS customer, if they do it, it's a benefit to them, streamlines things, simplifies things. That's the way for them to go, and then it's the biggest cloud there is, so that'll impact a lot of customers.
And Doug, you also mentioned hybrid multi-cloud. So let this be the last topic before we go into some announcements. There's been this kind of feeling that AWS does not really acknowledge multi-cloud.
They don't. They did today. Adam Slipsky was asked about it multiple times, and he kept favoring the hybrid.
I think
saying that other clouds are just a part of a hybrid landscape. To say that they have a Kubernetes distribution on which you can run Amazon services, that's really not the kind of solution that you've seen with Azure Arc and Google Anthos. I think those two clouds have made much more effort to run their world on AWS than AWS has made an effort to make their world runnable on Azure or Google Cloud. And I think Outposts is really about hybrid, making hybrid easy. They've made hybrid easier. They've addressed that robustly, but they really haven't addressed multi-cloud in a robust way.
That is very interesting analysis. I love that, because what you're saying is that the other cloud providers have provided this multi-cloud through the data plane running natively in other cloud providers. What AWS is saying is that we have the service called EKS Anywhere, which is container running containers.
It's a distribution, though. It's like
it's a distribution with
not
Kubernetes.
a simple thing to do.
Yeah. So if you run, because we know Kubernetes is not the easiest thing in the world. So if you can run EKS anywhere on any cloud provider, and the service supports EKS anywhere, then that service will run on other clouds. I think.
And then the other element where you've seen another cloud address multi-cloud more robustly, important in our world where the three of us follow analytics pretty closely, is Google BigQuery Omni, which isn't running Omni on another cloud, but it is bringing Parquet, bringing data extracts from other clouds.
That's a third way. Yes. Yeah. And the control plane will always be in the cloud provider's cloud. So the control plane sits there. The data plane could be in another place, or you could extract data from there, or you could run your services in a container. So I guess, those are the three. Okay, so let's go to announcements. So Tony, what were some of the biggest announcements from your point of view at this event?
Okay, well, put it this way. The one that had the most, I think probably the biggest, impression on me, more because basically I've been hitting on this as a pain point with AWS, was the zero-ETL, from Aurora to Redshift, because I've been on AWS's case, and I'm not the only one to say, look, you have so many services out there. You need to start basically putting some connective tissue there, because essentially otherwise you're putting the burden of integration on the customer's shoulders. And to its credit, AWS has realized that, and they have made that a core part of their message this year. They have so much work to do. I mean, when you have, I think they were saying like roughly around 200 services, more or less, and not to mention how many permutations of compute and storage instances, that makes for a very complex juggling act on the part of the customer. And go ahead.
No, and HTAP has existed for a long time. You've got MariaDB, you've got single store, you've got so many where it's a single database, like you were saying earlier.
Right. And the thing is that at this point, they've been so far down the road of the fit for purpose that what they're trying to do is now make that as best as possible in a world where basically customers have, basically very divergent needs. Now, I think it is interesting that maybe a few years down the pike, is not religious, that they could introduce basically we'll give it a code name of General DB.
By the way, I was expecting deep down that they will introduce analytics capabilities inside Aurora.
Yeah,
that was my suspicion.
Lots of hints. Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, put it this way, I think we have to put when we're putting analytics into an operational database, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we have to, I won't say take it with a grain of salt, but you have to, you have to proceed about it realistically. You have to scope it realistically. And the fact is, you're not going to do the really deep or the very high concurrency types of workloads, because basically in a transaction database, your main purpose is to keep the lights on. On the other hand, analytics that are relatively lightweight, which provide a feedback loop, I think make a lot of sense on an operational database. And we're seeing a number of folks right now. I mean, even Mongo. I mean, I met with Mongo earlier today. I mean, even they're starting to get serious about that, realizing that they're not the end all, the be all or end all. They're not going to replace data warehouses.
If you're close to SAP, right? SAP HANA came out years ago with like row store, column store, just in the same package.
Well, memory, time series, they cover all the bases.
Yeah, but again, the idea is like if it's in memory, the idea was we can the data is in canonical format, and in real time we can essentially just manifest it in the view that you want. And today, in addition to all that, we're increasingly seeing a model of basically API compatibility. And so that you just slap an API atop the database. And if you have a reasonably high performance storage, whether it be in memory or NVMe, SSD or something like that, you'll get performance that's essentially good enough. And so, yeah, I think there's a very good, there would be a good reason to basically, to add some operation, some lightweight operational analytic capability into Aurora. And some customers are already doing that. I've spoken to customers who are doing that.
Doug, so we've talked about zero-ETL quite a bit. I know even today we talked quite a bit about it. Doug, what other big announcements you saw?
Yeah, also in the vein of you could say a bit in the vein of kind of trying to connect the various Lego block services they have a little bit better and eliminate silos was the Amazon DataZone announcement. Very much in the metadata management, data cataloging vein. The focus today, it's early days, they acknowledge, will be on AWS sources and very much on business data catalogs, assist in creating and publishing these with the help of ML, populating, coming up with business-friendly terminology with the aid of ML, and then helping with access and discovery of data across presumably starting with all the Amazon different database services, for example. Partly they had kind of a competitive gun to their head, however, because Microsoft has already gone there with Purview. Google has Dataplex, so they really needed to answer the need to go down this path. What is not there yet is purely vision at this point, is supporting going beyond the AWS world to on-prem and third party.
Yeah, they said they'll have third-party application APIs. So an API for third-party applications.
But also they need to go deeper into governance with things like lineage and policy-based, more robust than just access control.
Yeah,
so I thought that was another important announcement, and it does help with connective tissue, as the term was used, among all the various services.
I think in today's Swami's keynote, Shikhar Verma did a great job of walking us through different capabilities, although we've yet to see DataZone. It's just an announcement, but
I still think they're a follower here, very much so.
Yeah,
is very modest. It does a fraction of what, for instance, Google Dataplex does. And
Purview started modestly. I think Dataplex started modestly.
Actually, I wouldn't say Dataplex. I wouldn't say Dataplex started modestly with their in terms of their approach is more. They have lots of capabilities, but on very few of their data platforms. In other words, like I think BigQuery was the first one supported, and they're only just gradually getting out to others. But in terms of functionality, Dataplex has been a lot more ambitious, even to the point of essentially they're also Virgin's territory of data fabric. In fact, Google really promotes it as an intelligent data fabric. And the fact is that prompts a question, admittedly, beyond the scope, I think, of this podcast, but I'll just introduce it briefly, is that if you want to have that governance layer, and that layer that also brings, do you also want to combine it with a layer that essentially is also the discovery layer and a layer that's also that's a delivery layer? That's a philosophic question that's right now under active debate in terms of with the whole idea of what is data fabric and what role does it play in all this. I think a couple other areas where I see AWS lagging. One area specifically is Lakehouse. And they claim the Redshift Spectrum is a Lakehouse. No, Redshift Spectrum still treats, yes, it treats, data in S3 as an external table, but there's a lot of there's a lot of huge performance penalty, and you don't really get the same type of granularity and security or anything.
I didn't even hear the term spectrum come up these whole
No, he answered that when someone asked about data lakehouse, he mentioned Redshift Spectrum.
It didn't come out organically. Yep.
Right, exactly.
And even with Spectrum, you're reading the external table data. It's all Redshift's proprietary format. It's not an open source Iceberg or Hoodie or Delta.
No. they're still keeping Redshift, and this is where I'm a little disappointed in AWS at this point, is that they're still keeping Redshift with its own, with own proprietary zone. It would be as if, let's say, Snowflake was not supporting Iceberg. Snowflake is. And they're actually doing so very energetically. They made actually, I think, pretty shrewd decision, because actually what Snowflake makes money on is not storage, but it's compute. And so, why not? And so they're actually putting a real effort into making, Iceberg a first-class citizen in Snowflake. Another question, one question they asked, I don't have the answer to it yet, is will Iceberg look like proprietary Snowflake? I do not have the answer to that yet. I will find that out. But I'm sorry?
Doug, do you have any thoughts on Lakehouse?
On what question?
Okay. There's so much stuff to cover. I want to have us move to Spark, because Spark was a big thing. But before we do that, I want to just complete a little bit of story about DataZone, because another announcement that came out this week is AWS Glue data quality.
Yes.
So now there's an ability to create your data quality rules and enforce them. The interesting thing, though, is that the question that came up amongst analysts was, why is data quality sitting in Glue and not in DataZone?
Bingo.
Exactly.
And
Bingo.
DataZone has a metadata, Glue has a data quality. Are they integrated? Not yet, but eventually it'll be. And what is AWS Glue? Data quality is actually a reworking of the open source DQ, which is spelled DEEQU. And so the Glue data quality is actually a managed service with some enhancements, not open source, of DQ. So that was an interesting discussion.
Well, I think that they made the point that Glue is the place where you do something about the data quality with transforming an action. So you have it there, and yes, they're promising that the DataZone will have insights into data quality. Not that you would do something about it there, and then SageMaker data wrangling addresses data quality as well. So you've got where the more technical people that are going to do something about data quality doing it there. I think DataZone is more of the catalog for the every user. Maybe down the road it has some function for giving a data steward, for example, an ability to do something about data quality. But with its beginnings, they're probably appropriately putting that where they're putting that.
I still think this is the legacy of the two pizza box rule. And the thing is that you had these teams that are basically innovating very rapidly, and so basically data quality ended up falling under the purview, no pun intended, of the
I don't know if I buy that pizza box thing. So you have a two pizza box team that goes off and handles the feature that's a part of the larger thing.
Yeah.
You can always do that.
Yeah.
So let's go to Spark. I think that's worth talking. Spark was everywhere. Yeah, Apache Spark. Yeah. So Doug?
Yeah, so they have a Spark from Redshift, very important for supporting data engineering and data science workloads. And it's really maybe it's not like firing off. We went through this in the session this afternoon. It's not about firing off Spark from Redshift. It's about being in a Spark instance and getting access to the information in Redshift. So that was an important one, and the other one was Athena Spark instances. So both of those are important.
Sure.
And an acknowledgement, and hey, look out, Databricks. They're doing more with Spark.
Well, put this, I would, if I were Databricks, I would not be feeling too threatened by that.
So Athena started as a Presto using Presto query engine, and now it's got Spark and also Trino. So now it's got three of them, and so we saw Spark show up in Athena and Redshift. I think a couple of other places. I think Glue, maybe support for Python was mentioned a few times. So quite a few things. Okay, so Tony, your favorite topic, data mesh.
Oh gosh.
What happened to data mesh this week?
I was afraid you'd ask. And,
I
and Sanjeev, as you asked that, you froze.
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, you're okay now.
Okay.
So what about, well, put it this way. This is something which I mean, earlier in the week, and this has nothing to do with AWS, but I just happened to have seen, and this is one area where I really do not cast any blame at all on AWS at all. In terms of, I think they're approaching this very cautiously. The good news is that they're not trying to data mesh wash, their products or anything like that. So I think they're to be saluted for that. Because I saw a piece earlier in the week, not from them, but it was in some sort of journal, the 8 top data mesh software companies, and I just ripped into it, said like, no, data mesh is not a technology, it's not a data mesh system, there's no such thing as data mesh software company. And this thing got like thousands of, it touched a nerve. I think that AWS is being very reactive here, but I think look, I think there's still a lot of questions over data mesh. When I put that post out, the debates came roaring up again, between basically, the promoters and the naysayers. And, and we're still, so, for AWS not to, let's say, basically, really, promote this and go full steam ahead, as opposed to, let's say, like company like Starburst. I think that makes perfect sense for them. On the other hand, I do think that basically I was a little at this point, in terms of data governance, DataZone is a very modest start. And whether you buy into the concept of data mesh or not, this really does not it doesn't do a lot in terms of I'll deal with the more tangible part of data mesh, of managing the life cycle of the data product. It's a very small piece. And guess what? Another piece of that is in Glue. And I think that's an architectural disadvantage. I would really like to. I would actually like to see the two tools merge.
Yeah.
That may be very counter to what AWS does, but I think in this case,
Because,
you're splitting hairs a little too much.
Because Glue has a technical metadata, DataZone has a business metadata, and by
Right.
metadata stores, you could just have one. I mean, that's what everybody does, because then you can
Yes.
map the two, and so much more you can do if you have one data catalog. I also feel, Doug, you may have seen this. There was a lot of sort of underlying message announcements on security. So fine-grained access control. We saw that in Redshift. Data sharing, like a central access control way of applying policies. It showed up in a different. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, centralized access controls for Redshift.
Yeah.
Amazon SageMaker, ML governance.
ML governance.
There was nothing earth-shattering, but we saw them hit on that theme of governance in a number of spots. I think overall they're stepping up, and they're also acknowledging, if analysts ask executives in analyst summit sessions, that they have a ways to go, and they're putting the vision out there, and they'll have a ways to go. And I agree with Tony. Mesh is about people and practices, not technology. Technology can support, but they're going to need a hell of a lot more governance and stewardship,
data privacy
interfaces and capabilities for the deeper governance folks and data owners, if they're ever going to enable mesh from DataZone.
Very nice. What do you think was missing this year? What was not covered sufficiently? Any thoughts? We talk about
I thought they could have done more to go up the stack, more applications maybe. I mean, there's a history at reInvent of delving into new areas. A few years ago it was space. They all suddenly had all sorts of satellite and space services. 5 years ago it was SageMaker. We got to start on SageMaker. This idea of applications, they had it with contact center. They announced supply chain. I didn't get enough face time on the vertical industry to see signs of applications and solutions. I think the storytelling gave more context on the Lego brick services that they have, but we didn't hear as much on solutions and use cases as we could. Certainly, there are very broad use cases in analytics and lakehouse that play in driving ML that could play across industries. We could have
Healthcare.
heard more about solutions and more about and seen more announcements around applications.
Yeah.
Got it.
I'll pick it up from there, which is that I have a slightly different view, which is that actually I'm glad that we didn't hear a lot of dramatic announcements this year. And I think at this point, AWS is, they have so much out there that their big challenge right now is blocking and tackling. And that's not the sexy stuff, but it's the necessary stuff. If you're going to be an enterprise player and you have all these services and you want to get more adoption, you have to start putting, and especially in terms of if you have this many discrete services, you have to start knitting this stuff together. I would like to, and the thing is that their approach to this at this point has been, we'll build connections, we'll build integrations. I would like to see them kind of bundle some of these services together. I mean, I would love, like in answer to basically, do we need a general purpose database? How about, let's say, a specialized and an optimized bundle of Aurora, and Redshift, and really optimize the hell out of that, and price it very attractively, because again, with the with the so-called zero-ETL, you're still paying for two databases. Now, of course, the way Amazon could price it, could make it seem like they're two databases for the price of one. There's always possibilities of putting in promotions like that. But I'd really love to see more bundling and more. And to Doug's point, the types of solutions I'm looking at are not application level. It's more basically use case level. In this case, essentially having, let's say, an operational analytics solution, and which could either put some analytics capability into Aurora, or basically optimize the pairing of Aurora, and Redshift, price them really attractively, and have
transaction data lakes.
That's what I'd love to see. Another thing I was really disappointed in, I will say, is in the Spark support. I still think they're just as they're keeping Redshift, kind of bounded off, wall garden off from the lake house, whatever it is. They kept it wall gardened off, from Spark. And I think that they should be able to invoke Spark as UDF in Redshift, because I'm seeing the others do it, and it makes eminent sense for certain types of workloads. And so I'm just a little disappointed that, okay, well, let Spark get to Redshift data. I would have also liked to see it the other way around.
Very nice. Okay, that's good. So these are good points. People from AWS watching this, they can discuss. Maybe when we have AWS reInvent 2023, some of your questions will be answered.
Well, let's end on a positive note here.
Yes, let's. Yep. So what's the most exciting part of this conference, Doug? What do you think? Networking?
Well, we've covered a lot of the most interesting and exciting things that, in terms of announcements, I was pretty bowled over by the 10th anniversary revisitation to AWS Marketplace. I think it's an unsung hero. 3,000 plus ISVs, 13,000 products, 330,000 customers. They went through all the private offers. Partner consulting offers. I think they do it. They've kept their knitting, and they do it quietly and do it to the masses. Some of their, their rivals highlight some really high-profile partners, probably because they don't have the bandwidth or the technology infrastructure that we see with the AWS Marketplace. But always there's a little intramural competition and a little bit more sense of concern that AWS might go into category. That's probably why they're so cautious about introducing applications. But I thought the Marketplace was, I was really pretty bowled over. And so clearly it's an important category for them.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it really shows, how AWS really invented this whole, market. I mean, they invented the modern cloud. and inventing the modern cloud, they invented the modern cloud marketplace, which the others have copied. And you know, it's like you can't give them enough credit for that. I mean, like, you know, it's just they've made this a normal, they've normalized this way of doing business and getting much easier access to applications through consuming your AWS credits. So it's like that was hugely revolutionary. As I said, you know, what really impressed me this year was, one, the energy is back. You know, the crowds were like, I mean, I was expecting that maybe we'd have a modest, because basically most of this year, most of the conferences have been at like, you know, half to a third of capacity. And this one, whoa boy, they took out the stops here and everybody showed up. We're back. I mean, we're back to the point where like now they're all the way up and down the strip, from the Wynn all the way down to the MGM, which goes pretty far down there. So that's, you know, pretty impressive. They had the shuttle buses back again. We had the hassles of having to cross the street and being directed, you know, the necessity of that.
I've been dragging Tony to take, you know, he's been yelled at for like jaywalking. I've been yelled at, although I don't really, it doesn't stop me.
You just want to get me arrested.
Yes, finally, high time. So on that note, we can go on forever. You know, I know Neptune, Graph Database, Serverless, so much, you know, you guys attended those sessions. RDS, writes became optimized. Instead of writing in 4K blocks and writing twice, is now 16K blocks using the Nitro, you know, hardware enhancers. So there's just so much to grapple here. But unless you have anything major to talk, I think we can end here. And
that was an undercurrent that the whole event started with, from Peter DeSantis, that so much of this is, you know, built on their custom chips. I know data scientists don't necessarily want to use Trainium and the inference chip that they have. They want to stay away from proprietary, but so much happens with the Graviton and Nitro. And you know, they made a big point that this is you know, lifting all boats on the AWS cloud in terms of performance.
Because it's pushing it down to the silicon.
Yeah.
A lot of performance. Yeah. Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like things like when you index something, you know, all that's like a very heavy CPU compute intensive job. If you can push it down to, or like mask data, encrypt data, and, you know, so, yeah. With that, I want to thank you so much. I know it's been like both of you we're all exhausted. Like it's been like a lot of like long days. Thank you so much for getting on this episode. Cannot thank you enough.
Good talking, Sanjeev.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks. Bye.